Chaye Sara. This week's Zedra. Iris, over to you. Oh, 1 second. Never works. Right, here we go. Yeah.
Okay, a minute. Right. Sarah dies at age 127 and is buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron, which Abraham purchases from Ephron the Hittite for 400 shekels of silver. Abraham's servant Eliezer is sent, laden with gifts, to Haran to find a wife for Isaac. At the village well, Eliezer asks God for a sign. When the maidens come to the well, he will ask for some water to drink. The woman who will offer to give his camels to drink as well shall be the one destined for his master's son. Rebekah, the daughter of Abraham's nephew Bethuel, appears at the well and passes the test. Eliezer is invited to their home, where he repeats the story of the day's events. Rebekah returns with Eliezer to the land of Canaan, where they encounter Isaac praying in the field. Isaac marries Rebekah, loves her, and is comforted over the loss of his mother. Abraham takes a new wife, Keturah, Hagar, and fathers 6 additional sons, but Isaac is designated as his only heir. Abraham dies at age 175 and is buried beside Sarah by his 2 eldest sons, Isaac and Ishmael.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Okay, so here's a quote from the Times, 19, I don't know when it was, a few years ago, and very annoyingly, well, there might be a reason for this, I don't know. Rabbi Sacks doesn't say who it is. He says he was a Jewish lord who was interviewed for the Times, and this is basically, he was at the age of 92, and they asked him, I don't know who it was, it could have been anyone actually, but anyway, it doesn't matter, whoever it was, they said to him, you're 92, and most people slow down, why are you speeding up? So who'd like to read this? Who's feeling 92 today?
Yeah, I'll read it first if you like.
Please. So it's a question and answer, basically.
Right. Most people, when they reach their 92nd birthday, start thinking about slowing down. Well, the Queen doesn't actually.
No.
You seem to be speeding up. Why is that? When you get to a 92, you see the door starting to close. And I have so much to do before the door closes that the older I get, the harder I have to work.
Right, interesting perspective, right? So you're thinking, oh, I'm getting older, I can start winding down. So the perspective is I'm getting older, I've got less time left to accomplish what I want to in this world. Queen is a really interesting example. I just saw an article by, I think it was Max Pemberton. Does he write in the Telegraph? Anyone follow his stuff? He's a GP, but he's a columnist as well. Interesting guy, young doctor. So he basically was praising the Queen for taking the day off work to recuperate, because he was saying that one of the hardest things is persuading people when they need a day of rest to recover from things. And too many people rush back to work and don't heal properly. I'm saying the fact that the Queen cancelled her engagements would basically set an example for other people. She is 95, to be fair, but you're right. No, she's not. I suspect in many ways we're not told the whole story. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, particularly since Prince Philip's death. And I'm sure Charles and William are very involved, but I'm sure she's also very involved. And I suspect she's busier than ever behind the scenes with the, in terms of the I would say the political machinations and so on of what's going on. And Harry and Meghan are keeping her busy. So anyway, this is an interesting perspective as you get older. I mean, the Rebbe always spoke about retirement in quite a negative way. It's one thing if you need a break from what you're doing and, or you want to go into a different direction, but just to retire for the sake of it, because you reach a certain age, why should you? There are plenty of people who are quite capable of carrying on. I'm not knocking retirement, but just because you're 65 or 67 or 70 doesn't mean you're any worse at the job you're doing. And many people carry on working into their 70s or 80s. I'm not saying you should if it's bad for your health and mental health and well-being, but why automatically assume that you should, people say, oh, it's nice to put your feet up. Yes and no. We probably all know people who've retired and struggled filling their time or possibly even get miserable. So this is sorry?
Rabbi, but a lot of people when they retire do other things.
Right. So
because sometimes they feel the job that they were doing is slowing them down for doing things that they really wanted to do. It could open up a whole new world.
So many people are busier than ever when they retire. And you see it, by the way, with people that, like Graham's a good example. I mean, he officially retired, I guess sold up his partnership, and now he's working part-time for himself. And I think he's busier than ever. I had a cousin like that who was a pharmacist. He became a locum. He was actually doing more hours. The difference was, he said that he was working for other people, not for himself. So he could go home at the end of the day without worrying. So you're right, 100%. But the assumption that you have to slow down because you get older, why? Right? This is a completely different perspective. It's a perspective that says the older you get, the less time you've got. So basically, grab every opportunity. Anyway, Avram seems to be like that. Let's have a look at Avram's life. Right? Sarah's 127, she dies. She's been his companion throughout. He's 137. He mourns her death. What does he do next?
Get married.
Gets married.
Well, besides that, yeah, I mean, that's not what he does. He marries again, but let's put that to one side. There are two very big things that happen this week, etc. I don't know what they are. We just read them, but they may not have stood out so much.
He sent for Eliezer to find a husband, a wife for his son.
Finding a wife for Yitzhak is a very big project. And before that, the purchase
finding somewhere to bury her.
Right. So the purchase of the Machpelah cave, a burial place for future generations, is quite a big project. 400 pieces of silver, presumably.
You've been placed on hold. Please wait.
Oh, that was strange.
Rabbi, how old was Isaac when Abraham took him?
Oh, good question. Anyone know the answer to this? Anyone else know the answer?
The thing is that Sarah died at 127.
Yes.
If she had him when she was 99, and she was still alive, he must have been in his. Some people say he was a child. Other people say he was about 40.
I believe he was 37, which
then Sarah couldn't have been alive then.
She died.
She was 127 when she died.
According to the Midrash, she died of shock. I think there's two versions. One that, well, she couldn't see that far, but it says that the Satan showed her a vision of her husband about to murder her son, right? And she didn't realize that it wasn't actually happening. And I think the Midrash says she actually died from shock. So there was actually a victim of the Akedah. According to the Midrash, Sarah actually died of shock. We knew someone in Cardiff, I'm not sure this was exactly the story, but it was very tragic. He decided to surprise his mother on her 90th birthday. And he came to visit from a foreign country. I don't know if it was immediate, but basically she got such a shock from the surprise that she actually ended up very ill from it. I think she eventually died. Now, it wasn't directly caused by that, but it was a bit of a strange one. So the timeline makes sense. I believe we're told that Yitzhak was 37 at the Akedah, which, by the way, I mean, this is last week's topic, but we'll talk about it now. The Akedah, whose test was it? Who's been tested? Avram. What do we call it? We call it the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak. Why? Surely the test is Abram. We should call it Abram's test. Or the binding that Abram had to do of his son or whatever. The answer is Yitzchak wasn't a child. He was a grown man, and therefore it was as much a test of his resolve.
That's very nice.
Basically, will he listen to his dad? Right? And it's a testament to the education he had that he followed blindly. And he may have had post-traumatic stress, we're not told. So according to the numbers you just cited, that the 37 makes sense. Yes, she had him when she was 90. She died at 127. So she would have died around the time of the Akedah. That makes sense.
You've been placed on hold. Please wait.
I don't know what's going on there. That's interesting. Is that Zoom doing that? Beryl, are you okay there?
I think it's Beryl.
Yeah, I'll just mute it for a minute. Okay, right. So yeah, he mourns for Sarah. He eulogizes her, it tells us. And then he moves on to two quite big projects for 137-year-old, sorry. First one is to go buy some land, which isn't so easy, right? There's a whole negotiation. Let's see what happens. What does Avram say? He comes along, he wants to read number 3.
I will.
Please.
I'm I'm a resident alien among you. Sell me a burial site among you that I may remove my dead for burial.
Right? The Hebrew phrase there is ger v'toshav. So let's just define some terms. When you say ger nowadays, people assume gerim means converts, but it can also mean a righteous Gentile who resides in the Holy Land and respects the laws. So in fact, it's called the ger toshav. A ger is a stranger or an outsider, and a toshav is a settler or a dweller. So resident alien basically says, look, I'm not one of you. He says to the Chittim, the Hittites, I'm a resident alien, I'm an immigrant. I'd like to buy a plot so that I can bury my wife. And what happens? They initially say no. What do they say to him? Anyone paid attention this morning? We read it. Or they basically say to him, there's no need, don't worry. You know, everyone respects you. You're a great guy. I'm quite sure we will provide a burial space for you in one of our cemeteries. You really don't need to buy ground, which is also a nice way of saying you're a foreigner. We don't want to sell you any. What happens in the end? Avram insists, right? And in fact, of course, it's in Hebron, isn't it? Right? And if you look at what goes on in the world today with Israel politics, he did a very smart thing, Avram.
Yes.
He paid for the land, and yet people still challenge it. Can you imagine if he hadn't paid for it? He paid for it fair and square. He bought a plot. But by the way, I don't know if it's here it says it, but you know, we're all very superstitious, right? You know, don't want to do things that might be, you know, God forbid, cause fate and so on. So you might think that buying land for burial is a very, you know, ominous thing to do. Why would I buy land for burial? Isn't that like 1 foot in the grave? So actually from here we learn that it's actually a segula for long life to buy a burial plot. Buying a burial plot is nothing to do with saying, I think I'm about to die or anything like that. It's a good Hamish, you know, wholesome thing to do as part of your things that you do in your life. You make sure you have a place for after 120 years, and you hope that it will be 120 years, basically.
Like taking your umbrella out in the shore, being convinced that if you take your umbrella out, it won't rain. If you don't take your umbrella, it will.
Right. So I'm sure I've quoted this before. Somebody once asked about Rebbe if they should buy life insurance. It's a big topic, by the way. Lots of people in the fun community don't buy life insurance. Not a great idea. I'm not aware of any halachic reason why you shouldn't. I know somebody once asked the Rav, am I allowed to buy life insurance? And the response he got was, unless you hate your wife and children, you absolutely should. Things happen, and you know, particularly if you have a large family. And the truth is, even when people have life insurance, it's often not enough. And you see these campaigns and things. But a lot of these campaigns to raise money for widows and orphans, and just not just the campaigns, because fine, people give tzedakah, but the indignity of having to go through that could be avoided if people have proper life insurance in place. Anyway, so somebody, I know in Liverpool, it was actually in the shul constitution that the ministers, I think actually the shul had to buy policies for the ministers, which is quite nice. Anyway, somebody asked the Rebbe once about buying life insurance, and he said, absolutely. He said, in fact, when you buy life insurance, you have 2 more people davening for your long life. One is the insurance agent, and the other is the actuary or something, or I don't remember, the underwriter. So, you know, there is definitely a superstition around not talking. You know, we don't talk about it. I was always taught, and I always learned, and I always preach that when you go visit someone in a hospital and the family say, Rabbi, what are we going to do about the shiva? You say, can we step out of the room, please? And we're not going to discuss it in front of the patient. And most people are sensitive to that. And sometimes they say, well, he's asleep, he can't hear us anyway. I say, we believe that a person hears on a deeper level, and it's a very distressing thing to talk about. In an ideal world, you say to people, well, why are we talking about this? The person's not dead yet. You don't quite put it like that. You say they're still with us and we should make the most of every moment. But the fact is, people worry about these things. It's human nature. So there's nothing wrong with worrying about, you know, if you would say, oh gosh, if anything happens, where are we going to hold the Shiva service? I don't believe that negatively impacts on a person's chances of survival. It's just a fact of human life. You know, you make preparations. That's what you do. You buy a plot, you buy a burial thing. But anyway, it wasn't easy for everyone. They initially refused, and eventually what happens? This is their response, right? Who wants to read the response to him?
I'll read it.
Yeah. Oh.
Hear us, my Lord. You are the elect of God among us, bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will hold his burial place from you for burying your dead.
Okay, so I'll share something slightly personal. I don't mind sharing this. One of the perks, it's actually quite a big perk, I suppose, actually, of going into the, I don't think it's all employees, but definitely ministers in the synagogue. You basically get free burial for life. So if you worked for 1 year and you leave the US, I think you don't. But if you worked for 10, 15, 20 years in the synagogue, you basically retain a complimentary, as it were, burial plot, which actually is worth, annual shul membership. It's quite a nice perk. If after you retire, you basically don't need shul membership anyway. It's quite a nice perk. Anyway, so I haven't decided. I haven't really thought about it, but like many people, by the time my kids get married, they might all move to America or Israel or something. If none of my family lived in this country, I'm not sure I personally want to be buried here. What's my attachment? My attachment is fine. I grew up here. It's my home country. But if none of my children even lived here, if my children all went to Israel, I'd probably quite happily be buried in Israel. And I wondered how that works. And the United Synagogue actually has some plots in Israel. You have to pay a lot of money for them. So I actually got in touch with Melvin. I said, I know that there is a provision for ministers for burial as a sort of perk. Sounds funny, but whatever. As a I don't know what you call it, benefit. What happens if someone wants, to be buried in Israel, something like that? Is there a procedure for basically sort of reserving that or arranging that? And basically, he said, no, he said, what we do is when a retired minister or any minister passes away, basically the trustees at the time on a very high level will make an immediate decision as to, what plot they get. He didn't quite say this, but I guess what he was saying was, when it's Rabbi Sacks, obviously it goes without saying that he got buried right at the front in Bushy. If you're slightly more minor league, then they might offer you a nice plot in the corner of Waltham Abbey or something like that. And if you've been in the synagogue for 50 years and you want to be buried in Israel, they might well cover your costs. They decide on the day. So I thought to myself, that's interesting. I thought, I'm not getting into this now, but actually it's exactly the same issue almost. It's what happens if you turn around and say, yeah, but I don't want to rely on your generosity. Actually, I would quite like to make these arrangements for myself. Can I pay a fee to ensure that I get ... No, we'll take care of you. Don't worry. You might think, well, what happens if the trustees don't like me? Any number of scenarios. So Avram here, they say to him very respectfully, no, we respect you. You're a man of God. We'll give you the best plot out. He says, nonetheless, I'd like to pay my way. I'd like to know for sure. And he does eventually pay for the land, 400 shekels, and there we go. But it's a negotiation for a 137-year-old. It's probably quite tiring. And he pays 400 shekels, which we're told is probably more than it's worth. Now, we're not told exactly why, but the purchase of the cave of Machpelah is clearly significant. It's recorded in great detail. We're given some of the kind of contractual stuff about it. He bought it, how much he bought it for, and so on and so forth. And it actually appears 3 times. I'm just going to give you one on the screen now. It appears 3 times in the book of BEREISHIS at great length with a certain formality. Let's see what Jacob says on his deathbed to his sons. Who'd like to read? Julian, have you read yet?
No. Bury me with my fathers in the cave of the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites.
Very specific. Could have just said, bury me with my fathers in the cave, in the field of Ephron, Machpelah, near Mamre, which Avram bought, and where Avram, Sarah, Yitzhak, Rivka, and Leah are all buried. He mentions the word Hittite at least 3 times. It's almost like you can almost imagine, I don't think this was the case, but imagine a conversation, the equivalent of somebody nowadays giving a talk. Let's say somebody, I'm going to say quote unquote right wing, is giving a talk to, I don't know, let's say a Christian audience. And they say, well, this is the land of Israel where Avram bought a plot of land from the Hittite and he buried his wife there, and in this plot which he bought from the Hittites, which he bought, and he buried his, also, I buried my wife there in this plot which my grandfather bought. You know, it's almost like overemphasis, but it's really hammering home the point. So there's clearly something significant here. Why does it have to keep going about where it is and who Avram bought it from? Well, interestingly, right after this story of Machpelah, what do we read next? It says, Lisa, would you like to read?
Yeah, sure. Abraham was now old, advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things.
Right. Does that sound like the beginning of a sort of long and fruitful life, or the end of a long and fruitful life?
End.
End, right? It sounds quite, you know, it's closing. Avram was old, he was advanced in years, he had everything he needed. And yet, what does he do next? He starts a new initiative, starts a shidduch system to find a wife for Isaac, right? What does he tell Eliezer? He says to the senior servant, put your hand under, this is, oh, I didn't quote the whole thing, right? He says, put your hand under my thigh. This is a strange one. We don't recommend it nowadays with safeguarding, but we find in the Bible that when, anyone been to court? I hope not. Ever been to court? Had to swear an oath? I was there as a witness once. Had to swear, well, no, I said I want to affirm. So if you affirm, then you don't. But the interesting thing is, swearing on the Bible comes directly from Judaism. And the only reason we don't do it is because we don't feel it's something we should do in a secular court. But the concept of swearing on a ritual object is a very Jewish one. So back in Avram's days, they didn't have printed Chumashim and Sifrei Torah. And so what object did Avram have which had been used for religious purpose? Right? Don't laugh. His bris. So we find always, if you look a few times, it says, place your hand upon my groin, place your hand upon my thigh and swear. Basically, the only object I have, which is a ritual object right now, is my male organ. So place your, as like I said, don't do this at home, but place your hand upon it and swear on it. So anyway, that's the quote here. But he's basically saying, so he says to Eliezer, I should have given a longer quote. He basically says to Eliezer, please swear an oath that you will go and find a nice wife for Yitzchak, and he gives all kinds of, you know, stipulations. He doesn't say she should come from good stock, from my own family, but it's kind of implied. And again, the Torah describes it in great detail. You may recall that when Eliezer comes back home, he tells the story again in great detail. You know, some things in the Torah are barely touched upon. You know, even the Tower of Babel's a few lines. Okay, the flood is slightly more detail. But here, both of these things, the cave of Machpelah and the getting of a wife for Yitzchak, are discussed in great detail. Every conversation, every nuance. And again, look at the binding of Isaac last week. We were talking about this in our Shabbos afternoon share. We're not told what the thoughts or intentions were. It's very vague. Such a seminal event in Jewish history is very vague. Meanwhile, we're given all kinds of contractual information. We're reminded about 3 times that Avram bought it from the Hittites. I got it already. You say it once. Why are you saying it 3 times? It's a very unusual style of narrative for the Torah. The Torah is usually brief. So, question, what did God promise Abram? 2 big things.
That he would have a very large set of descendants,
Yeah.
and that he would have the land that God was showing him.
Right. Yes. So land and kids. So let me ask you a question. Even though he had Yitzchak, it's hardly like being as numerous as the stars, is it? So the 2 stories here.
No, it's not.
The purchase of land, the first ever purchase of land in the land of Israel, and his going out to find a wife for Yitzchak, which is going to cement the future of his grandchildren. These are the events, bless you, that the Torah goes into extreme detail about and repeats. And these events both connect to very central promises from Hashem. Let's just have a quick look, right here. This is from BEREISHIS chapter 13 and 17. You may recognize this as an old Israeli song. Anyone remember that song?
No.
an old Israeli song. Let us come and walk about the land through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you. Right? And then we have, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. Just as you can't count the dust of the earth, you can't count your offspring. Avram says, yes, I can. I've got one. Yitzchak, easy to count. Right? And when he changed his name from Avram to Avraham, he says, father of a multitude of nations. So we've got a curious thing here. We've got two promises. By the time Sarah dies, one hasn't been fulfilled at all. He's not inherited the land. And the other, he's got one kid who's not even married at 37. Right? What Jewish mother can stand by and watch her kid at 37, not yet married? I know they lived longer in those days, but still, I think 37 was probably quite old. They probably got married very young in those days. I think Rivka, according to some opinions, was extremely young. Again, don't go down the safeguarding route with that one. Isn't there one opinion she was 3, I think? Possibly. Anyway, so what's going on here and why is it so important? So what both these things have in common is very interesting. We often talk about blessings and we talk about channels for blessing, making a kli, making a receptacle, a channel for God's blessing. You know, it's all very well saying God will shower you with blessings, but you have to receive those blessings. Otherwise, they'll just fall to the ground. When the Torah says that if you honor your parents, you'll be granted long life, does that give you an automatic get out of jail free, card that you will, no matter what? Well, clearly not. There are people who honor their parents and don't seem to have long life. But God promises it. So the usual explanation we give is that you have to merit God's blessings, even if you have a promise. It doesn't automatically. God promising Abraham that he'll have offspring doesn't mean he can just sit back and put his feet up. So these two events have the same thing in common. They each represent a conscious action and an effort to bring about God's promise. Avram doesn't sit there waiting for the land to just empty out so he can go in it. He buys some land. Yes, it's for a burial plot, but the more significant thing is he is buying land in the Holy Land. And without getting too political, it always fascinates me. Last count, I think there were 400 Jews living in Hebron and about 80,000 Arabs. My mother said to me years ago, why do they have to live there and be provocative? And I said, as it happens, a lot of them are quite provocative. They're quite right-wing. I said, but just to put it in perspective, I said, as a percentage, I think it's about the same as the percentage of Jews in the UK. You don't say that someone's provocative just because they're a small minority, number one. Number two, Hebron is the first place that we have any claim to because Avram bought land there. It was there in Jewish history. It precedes Jerusalem or any other sort of city in Israel. So it's an interesting one. Anyway, they both have one thing in common. It's a tangible thing that Avram is doing to bring about God's blessing. From this, we learn a very fundamental point as follows. This is Rabbi Sacks' words. Who'd like to be Rabbi Sacks today? Anyone who hasn't read yet?
I'll read again if you like.
Come on, Jeff.
God promises, but we have to act. God promised Abraham the land, but he had to bury the first field. God promised Abraham many descendants, but Abraham had to ensure that his son was married and to a woman who would share the life of the covenant, so that Abraham would have, as we say today, Jewish grandchildren.
Right? So this is a very axiomatic point in Judaism. When God promises us something, we have to do what we call our, bless you. You okay? We have to do what we call our hishtadlut, which is we have to make an effort for ourselves.
God helps those who help themselves.
Exactly. So it's the famous lottery ticket joke. God help me win the lottery. God help me win the lottery. Eventually says, I'm trying, but you have to buy a ticket, right? You have to buy a lottery ticket. Why? If Hashem's going to bless me, okay. But the answer is actually, did I put this on the next slide? Yes, here we go. Right. Why is this? So let me just explain further from Rabbi Sacks. Despite his promises, God does not and will not do it by himself, by the very act of self-limitation, tzimtzum. I'll explain that in a minute. Through which he creates the space for human freedom. He gives us responsibility, and only by exercising it do we reach our full stature as human beings. Put it another way, we can receive his blessings if we create a suitable vehicle for them. What is tzimtzum? Tzimtzum is the act, I don't know if you've come across this yet in the Tanya Shir ever, but tzimtzum is the idea that God created the world and basically then removed himself from it contracted himself because he's very big, he's infinite, takes up a lot of space. If God was really in the room with you, you'd feel his presence. So basically withdraws, leaving behind a world of our choice and our actions and reactions. So when God says, I promise you this, we have to go out and say, right, God promised me great wealth. I'm going to go and find a job, knowing that God has promised me I will be successful. I'm going to find a shidduch for my son, knowing that God has promised me that my offspring will inherit, will be multiplicitous. But nonetheless, I need to find a shidduch for my son in order for that to happen. Right? And maybe I believe that God will help me find the shidduch because he's promised me blessings. So when God promises you a blessing, it's not a miraculous, things falling out of the sky. It's often a miracle that takes place with the natural order of things. So you say, thanks to Hashem's blessings, Avram found a good, nice shidduch for his son, but it took Eliezer's efforts to actually do it. Thank God I recovered from my illness. I had a very good doctor who helped me on the medical side. I thank Hashem for orchestrating that. Thank God I found a ... Thank God I was, yes, there's a natural process as well. And that's how the world works. That's how Hashem set up the world. We don't have flashes of lightning and miracles the whole time, but we have to make the effort ourselves. When we make the effort, he will bless us. As Ira said, God helps those who help themselves.
It's good saying like that. God helps those that help themselves, but God help those who get caught helping themselves.
I was just thinking that. I was just thinking that there's a nice double meaning there. It's like the joke about the Catholic school where they had a big sign by the apples, only take one each, God is watching. So someone will put up a sign by a bowl of oranges, take as many as you like, God's watching the apples, right? So yes. So this is a fundamental principle of Judaism we've come across many, many times, how Judaism views the world, right? What's the best segula, the best good omen for making a good parnasa? My friend used to say, get a job. But getting a job can be hard. So you dam Hashem, they'll help you find the right path for your parnasa. They'll help you find the right shidduch. They'll help you with your good, with health. They'll help you find whatever, the right community to go and live in or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, you have to do your bit as well. You have to do your due diligence, as it were. It's a very important concept. So why are so many column inches in the Torah given up to Avram's purchase of a cave and his quest for a wife for his son? The answer is because there's something bigger at play there. It's showing us that even when Hashem gives you an explicit promise, you have to do your part as well. It's a partnership. You have to do your bit, knowing full well that it comes from God. If someone is struggling with fertility, we don't say, go pray to God. We say, give tzedakah, check your mezuzahs, daven every day, and go to the best specialist you can find to address any medical issues. Do both, right? When someone's not well, we say Tehillim, we add the name to the Mishaberes. At the same time, we want them to get medical attention. If you want Jewish grandchildren, start working on a shidduch for your kids. My father said years ago, over the years, he got many calls when he was involved in the shul in Oxford. A woman calls up and says, my son's coming up to Oxford and he's very shy. I'm wondering if you could help him meet some nice Jewish girls. Maybe you could get him invited round for dinner with some nice Jewish girls. He doesn't really put himself out there very much. What do you say to that? My dad said he was tempted to say maybe he has to learn to put himself out there more. There's only so much you can do. I know you're a Jewish mother. You want to help your son, but at some point he's got to try for himself. So Rabbi Sacks says this is actually an important principle also of leadership, that when we're a leader and when we're setting an example like Avram, the example we should set is exactly this, that if you want God's blessings, you got to work on it. And Avram, when he's 137, his wife's just died, instead of sitting back and saying, I'll wait for God's blessings to come, I've earned them, he gets busy with big projects. He goes to buy some land and he goes to look for it. Well, he doesn't directly, but he directs the shidduch process for his son. And maybe that's also something that we find often with great leaders. We have this interesting quote about Moshe, right? It says Moshe was 120 years old when he died. His eyes had not dimmed. His vigor was unabated. It says he was working till his last day, right? No retirement for him. He had full energy until he basically went. So it's the same idea, because we have to have that energy. And also the point is when God gives you a big promise, like a land or lots and lots of children, you have to start somewhere. You have to start that journey. It starts with something small. So finding a shidduch for Yitzchak isn't going to bring about millions of people in the world, but it's the next step. Buying a small plot of land for burial isn't conquering the land of Israel, but it's the first step. And often the first step is the hardest. So there's a nice message in that as well. That Avram here is the trailblazer, right? He's the first one to buy land in the land of Israel. He's the first one to basically have his son get married and have grandchildren that will be the future of the Jewish people. It's never easy to be the trailblazer. It's much easier to follow where others have trodden before. So that's also a message, again, of leadership. So to end in Rabbi Sacks's immortal words, here we go. Whoops, lost it. 1 second. That's what Rabbi Sacks has to say. He says, leaders see the destination, begin the journey, and leave behind them those who will continue it. That is enough to endow a life with immortality. Very prophetic, that. I don't know what year Rabbi Sacks said that, but it's very true of his life as well. His teachings are still being published. There's still material out there. And people are learning his teachings and applying them. And they're often used, particularly when people want to talk about leadership and models. So it's a very profound idea there. See the same thing with Avram, but it's not just about taking the first step. It's about being a leader. That you embark on that journey knowing full well you won't complete it. We have the same thing with Moshe and the promised land. But you start the journey and you leave behind you people who are capable, which actually ties in very nicely with next Sunday morning share about Joshua. Because Moshe may not have made it into the promised land, but he made sure that the succession was in place and the tools are in place. So Avram, by his actions, initiates a very important sort of path of receiving God's blessings, but doing it through our own efforts. And his children, presuming grandchildren after him, also knew that same idea as well.
Rabbi.
And in fact, so I'll just say, how do we know they internalized that message? Because we see with Yaakov, it says Yaakov was afraid when he lay down and put the stones around his head. So they say, what was he afraid of? Right? We've learned this before. What was he afraid of? God promised him that, he's got a future. The answer is he was afraid he wouldn't be worthy to receive the blessings. So that humility also, and that recognition that even with God's blessings, I have to be a suitable channel for them. I have to make sure that I do my bit to receive them. Yes, Iris.